we are doing now, with you having covered the Hebrew alphabet, getting to know the Hebrew alphabet, being able to recite it, that is very important. We are now going to be focusing our attention on some of the characteristics of those letters. We've already begun to see some of them, but it's very important that we appreciate that each of the letters will tend to exhibit some characteristics that's going to affect the way in which we are able to read biblical Hebrew. But I like to use the opportunity and to exploit the opportunity of being able to, as far as possible, repeat certain things, so that it gets entrenched. So to start out this class, allow me to go through the Hebrew alphabet again, so that the tune of the recitation gets entrenched in your mind, and that the pronunciations as well, becomes part of that as well. So the Hebrew alphabet goes as follows: Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samech, Ayin, Pe, Tzade, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. Okay, so that's the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Now, you would then have noticed, as we started looking at the alphabet, and I've indicated that to you, and sorry, for some reason the connection here causes some of the points probably not to be made, and so now it comes up with that green hue, but I think it's clear enough, so I'm not going to mess anymore with that connection. You would have noticed that as we proceeded with the Hebrew alphabet, that there were some letters, in fact 6 of them, 6 of the letters occurred with a dot. Okay, a dot written in them. That dot is a very, very important dot. That dot has got a name. I'm going to introduce you to that dot, and you're going to discover how important that dot is. But as we do in language study, often when letters and there are these characteristic features that emerge, one wants to come with a way of referring to those letters as a group. Okay, and that's one of the things that is developed with biblical Hebrew. These 6 letters that occurs with a dot. And when you take a look at the alphabet at the bottom, it becomes very clear what those letters are, reading Hebrew from right to left. It is Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Kaf, Pe, and Tav. That are the letters that occurs with that dot. So on the slide, doing it again from right to left, like we do it in Hebrew, the letter Beit, which communicates with a dot in it. Its equivalent is like the English letter B. Phonetically, it's the sound B, as in boy or bat. Okay, so that's the sound that it makes. A Gimel with a dot in it makes the sound G, as in go. Okay, then the letter Dalet is like our English letter D. It makes the D sound phonetically, as in door. Okay, so that is B, G, and D. Then the next one is the letter Kaf, which is the equivalent of our English letter K, as in kite or kit. Okay, then the next one is the letter P, which is like our English letter P. It makes a P sound phonetically, P. And then the final one is the letter Tav, that is the equivalent of our English letter T, as in tall. The sound that it makes phonetically is T. So when we begin to say those sounds together, B, G, D, K, P, T, what Hebrew grammarians have done is they have taken that, transcribed it to English, between the letters added the letter E and the letter A, grouping them in 3. Then we get almost like an acronym, a mnemonic, which reads Begad Kapat. You see that? Begad kapat. You have the B of the bait, the G of the gimel, the D of the dalet, the sound, right? We add the letter E, a small e after the B, a small letter A between the G and the D, and then you get the word begad, right? And then you take the K of the letter kaf, the P of the letter P, the T of the letter tav, and you add again in between them an E and an A for that 3, and then you get this little useful designation, begad kapat, begad kapat. So that when we are going to begin to talk about these letters, which is going to become very important as we begin to get deeper into Hebrew, and as we begin to take a look at the patterns of words, how words are pronunciated, how they are formed, and what are the things that will influence the changes within that, it's going to be very useful to talk about these letters as a group, because they will often exhibit the same characteristics. Okay? And so we will refer to them as the Begad kapat letters. Right? So when I use the term Begad kapat letters, we mean the 6 letters of the Hebrew alphabet that can be written with a dot or without the dot. Now we need to define what that dot is. That dot has actually got a name. And as you can see on the slide, that dot in the middle of the letter is called Dagesh Lini. Dagesh Lini. And what Dagesh Lini means, Dagesh is the name of the dot, and Lini is what describes its function. It means a hardening dot. That's basically what the word Dagesh Lini means. A hardening dot. Meaning that when that dot occurs inside that letter has got one of at least 2 pronunciations. Okay? And when the dot occurs in the letter, Dagesh Lini tells you, pronunciate this letter by the hard sound. Okay, are you with me?
Yeah.
Okay, so the name of that dot is Dagesh Lini. Okay, so that's what we're going to be talking about. That's what we're going to be calling it. Its presence in the letter indicates that that letter is to be pronunciated with the hard pronunciation. Or linguistically, phonetically, we call it the plosive pronunciation. So that when I make the sound, as it is transliterated, the bait will be b, you can hear, strong sound. The gimel will be g, the dalet will be d, the kaf will be k, the pe will be p, and the tab will be t. You can hear very hard pronunciations. The absence of that Dagesh Lini will then indicate that this letter will then have to be pronunciated by its alternative soft pronunciation wherever that is possible. Okay? And because our pronunciation of Hebrew comes from the pronunciation of modern Hebrew as it was decided in the year 1948 when Hebrew was standardized, people came with their different pronunciations of Hebrew and they went for Sephardic Hebrew. They discovered that even with time, some of the pronunciations of the letters became unaffected by the presence or the absence of the dot. Historically, there would have been a difference, and I'm going to illustrate that to you. But with time, and this happens very naturally in language, there are some letters that will change their pronunciation. And this is true even for English. You go to old English inscriptions, you will see characters that you won't recognize. And part of the reason for that is, in the past, there were certain English words that we take for granted and that we think was always the same that actually changed their pronunciation over the years. And so some of the letters even change in order to communicate that. Now, the letters that will be affected will be the bait, the kaf, the pe, and the tav. The gimel and the dalet is not affected because those sounds historically would have been so difficult to make. And as I said, I'm going to illustrate that to you. You will see that given that difficulty, and not just that, because it's very natural, because language is very dynamic. the way in which we pronunciate words. You can even see this, you know. We've got South African pronunciations, we've got American pronunciation, you've got British pronunciations and other pronunciations of words. Even in South Africa, you know, among so-called English, people will say words in a slightly different way, because that's the nature of language. And sometimes that is what happens even with ancient languages like Hebrew. So it is possible to then come up with a different pronunciation. So, and I don't want to get too technical, you know, but some of them are useful as an example, using some of the technical language to describe how these pronunciations change. I'll do that with the first letter, the letter bait, because that one is so obvious when it changes pronunciation. So when the letter bait occurs with a dot, with a Dagish linie, that dot tells you, you need to pronunciate this letter phonetically by its hard pronunciation. And that hard pronunciation, if you think about it carefully, what you're doing with the parts of your mouth, you will hear that you are performing what is called a bilabial plosive. And what that means is the word labial means lips. You've got two of them. You're using both of them, bilabial. And you're allowing the air coming out of your mouth to explode. You hear that? Bilabial plosive. B. You get it? It's an explosion, a B sound, very hard. The absence, however, take the Dagish linie away, and that absence of the Dagish linie says, now you have to pronunciate the letter with its alternative soft pronunciation. Now, what is that soft pronunciation? Well, we don't actually have that sound in the English language. Neither do we have a letter that exactly duplicates that sound. We do, however, have a letter that Hebrew doesn't have, technically speaking, that gets close. And that is our English letter V. Okay? So, the soft sound will then be called a bilabial, not plosive this time, but fricative, meaning it's the soft pronunciation. So it is as if you're just about to say the B sound, but instead of closing your lips to cause the explosion, just as your lips is closing, you allow the air to come out, but you open up your lips again. And then you get the sound, and so you can imagine, you know, we've not grown up with that sound, but the closest sound that we have to that is the English letter V, you know, where we make it a dental labial fricative. We use our teeth, that's what the word dental means. We put it against our bottom lip, and we bring them together, and we rush the air through it, and then we get the sound V, V. Okay? So that is actually how we're going to treat the pronunciation in this class when a bait doesn't have a dot. We're not going to attempt to say V, because it's not the sound that we're familiar. We're going to treat it with V. Because even in practice in Hebrew today, Hebrew speakers actually tend to do that, you know, because they are influenced by other languages. Okay, so you get the idea, you know, that you've got these letters where the presence of the dot means Dagish linie, hard pronunciation, the absence of the dot, soft pronunciation, then you go for the softer alternative pronunciation. That doesn't happen with the gimel and the dalet. Why? Let me illustrate that to you. Okay, so the sound that the gimel makes, we actually make in the back of our throat. And what we do is we bring up sound, and then we close and we open the back of our throat. And then we say G. Right? You got that? G. Now imagine trying to do that, making that G sound without closing it completely. Then you get the sound very difficult sound to make. Which in spoken Hebrew, you know, when people speak so fast, you kind of miss that sound. And so with what happened with Sephardic Hebrew is that difficult sound, the gimel without the dot, just became G. Because they said, they just leave it like that, it's an easier sound to make. The same thing happens with the dalet. The sound that the dalet makes, you can hear, is you're taking your tongue and you're pushing it up against the back of your teeth and the roof of your mouth, and you explode the sound. You say D. D. Okay? So how do you make the soft sound? Well, you take your tongue and just before you're going to hit the roof of your mouth and the back of your teeth, you make the sound without it touching. And then you get the, you know, very, very difficult sound to make, especially when you are trying to speak fluently. And that's one of the reasons why that difficult sound fell out of use. And that is why we are going to pronunciate a gimel with a dagesh and without a dagesh the same. We're going to pronounce it g as in go, and we're going to pronunciate a dalet with a dagesh and without a dagesh by its hard sound d. Okay, we're not going to draw any distinctions. The other three, however, are going to change, you know, because that still happens in Hebrew. So the kaf with a dot, loud sound, k as in kite or cat with a K. Okay, that's the k sound. Once again, you are making a sound in the back of your throat. You know, you're doing a lot of gymnastics with your tongue and your palate, and you are slightly roughening that sound to get the k sound out. K. Now, when you take the dot away, what's the soft version of that sound? The soft version of that sound is like a soft chet sound. So remember the letter chet, which is that one over there, okay, is a very strong sound. It's like we're trying to clear something from the back of our throat. Okay? That's what we're saying. The kaf is a slightly softer sound than that. So that when you say k with a dot, without a dot, it becomes ch. Ch. Okay? So it's a softer ch sound than a chet. Okay? Ch. From k, you get ch. The next one is the letter P. So that's like your English letter P. P. Right? That's the sound that we make. But what if we make a P sound soft? Then we actually get F. Hebrew doesn't actually have a F sound like we have in English, but it has a sound that comes very close to that, which is a P without a dagesh lini. So as in the alternative of the spelling of the name Stephen. So we can have Stephen with a V or Stephen with a PH. Okay? And Stephen with a PH is F. Or as in the word phlegm, PH. The PH sound in English makes P. It's like saying a P and an H together. P. It's F, we say. Okay? So we will treat it P without a dot, not as P. We will say F, because that's the sound that we have, and it's fine, and in modern Hebrew they do that anyway. And then the last one is the letter Tav, which is a strong T sound, and without the dot, it becomes like your TH sound in English. Th, as in this, or that, or therefore. TH sound. Th, without the dot. Okay? So are you with me? Right, the Begakapad letters are the 6 letters that can be written with a dot in it. That dot is called a dagesh lini, a hardening dagesh. When you write it out, and for example, this is what happens in the alphabet. When you write out the alphabet and you say the alphabet, you say each of those letters with a dagesh lini in it, which means hard pronunciation. But when you're going to encounter it in words and the dot is gone, the dagesh lini disappears, then that means you're going to have to pronunciate it with a soft pronunciation. Okay? So B becomes V, G remains G, D remains D, K becomes H, P becomes F, and T becomes Th. Okay? And so those are your Begakapad letters. Remember that. We're going to be dealing with some examples later on as a way of practicing that, for you to be able to see it. I first needed to make sure that you understand it. Any questions on that? Are you with me? We good? Right. Now let's take a look at some more characteristics. Do you have a question, Daniel?
Yes, yes. Just to clarify my understanding with the pair, if it doesn't have a dot, it becomes a PH basically. You pronounce it as a PH.
Correct. F.
Okay.
As in PH.
I just with the sound of a Zoom didn't do it justice.
Sure, I understand that. Yeah. Okay, moving on to some other characteristics of letters. Now, this characteristic is what I call an aesthetics characteristic. Okay? Aesthetics is the study of beauty. How you make things look beautiful or pleasant. Okay? And that often happens in language. You know, when we write out words, you know, sometimes we develop a more beautiful way of writing that. You know, so for example, in English, you know, I mean, in English, we're not getting into calligraphy necessarily, but you know, we have this convention in English, just like you discovered in Greek, that we've got an alphabet, but the alphabet comes in two versions, right? Uppercase, lowercase, right? Hebrew doesn't have that. Hebrew just got one standard letter. There's no distinction between uppercase and lowercase. Greek has also got that. Uppercase, lowercase, capital letters in other words, and lowercase. In which over time you develop a convention and aesthetic. So for example, in English, the way in which we use capital and lowercase is to bring out certain things in a sentence. You know, so we've got certain conventions. We will start out a word, you know, in English with a capital letter. You know, so just like I have over there, characteristics of the Hebrew alphabet. The word characteristic starts with a capital letter C, but all the other letters is lowercase. That's the aesthetic of distinguishing and how we use a capital letter versus a lowercase letter. But English has also developed some other conventions that we will also, when it comes to proper nouns and place nouns, you know, the names of people or the names of things that are definite, we will also write them with capital letters inside the sentence. And that is why the H of the word Hebrew has got an A, has got a capital H, and that is why the A of the word alphabet is A, because the word the is a definite noun describing what these two things are. The Hebrew alphabet, you know, one concept, using two words. That's the aesthetic of using uppercase and lowercase letters in English. You with me? Right? Now you will remember, because I think all of you have done Greek, you have discovered that there are some letters that when they occur at the end of the word, they actually change their form. It doesn't change the meaning of the word in any way, and the pronunciation also doesn't change. Okay? And there are 5 consonants in the alphabet that behaves like that.
At the end?
Yeah. That when this consonant stands at the end of a word, and it is, in other words, it's got no vowel under it associated with it and nothing follow it. It is the last letter within the word. Then these 5 letters will change the way in which they are written. And that happens for aesthetic reasons. Because it just looks nice. Because it's beautiful. And those are the letters Kaf, Mem, Nun, Pei, and Tzadeh. Okay? So those are the 5 letters in Hebrew that when they occur at the end of the word, they will change their form. They will be written in what we call its final form. The pronunciation won't change except for the letter Kaf, you know, because typically when the Kaf stands at the end of the word, it will drop its Tagishlini and then it will be soft pronunciation. And the same thing will happen with the letter Pei. You know, so typically your Bagarkapat letters, they are going to be pronunciated strongly when they stand at the beginning of the word or when they stand at the beginning of a syllable. But typically when they stand at the end of the word or an end of a syllable, they will change their pronunciation. But when these 5 stand at the end of the word, they will change their form. So when a Kaf stands at the end of the word, it will look like that, which looks like a Dalet, but it's not a dalet. And the reason for that is, you have to now take a look at the letters right on top and imagine that they're all on the same line, they're written on the same line. And you would have noticed that for Hebrew. Look at the alphabet at the bottom. The letters are all written with a very similar aesthetic. You try and keep the letters more or less the same size, the same shape. They are written between the lines, except that there are a few that will buck that arrangement. So, for example, a lamed starts out above the line. You see that, and a kof will end below the line. So, just like the kof is written with the spot that goes below the line, so the final form, some of them, not many, will have this extended part that goes below the line. Just like you have this little long part of the kof over there. So a final kaf, a kaf at the end of the word will not be written like that. A kaf at the end of the word will be written like that, as if you are drawing a dalet, but instead of stopping where the line would be, you drop it below the line. Okay, and that will be a final kaf. A mem will radically change its shape. From that little symbol over there, it becomes like a square with a tail on at the end that, as I said, must not be confused with the letter samech. So go down into the alphabet and you'll see over there is the letter samech. You see that? Looks very similar, but it's not the same. Because the samech is nice and rounded, and you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, the bottom left-hand corner, it's very rounded. But with the final mem, it's got a sharp corner in the bottom right-hand corner and a sharp corner in the bottom left-hand corner. And it's got that little tail out there. So it looks very similar, but they're not the same letter. Okay? And let me say this to you. In the beginning, I know it's difficult to see the difference, but you will get so used to it. Because most of the time, I can say 9.5 times out of 10 times in Hebrew, when the word ends with that symbol, it's going to be a final mem. It is rare that samech stands at the end of the word. There are instances where that happens, but it is rare. So you can kind of get used to that. With that, when the word ends like that, it's probably going to be a final mem. But once your eye is in and you get used to being able to distinguish a printed final mem from a samech, it's not actually going to be a problem. The final nun is just like you're going to be writing a nun, but instead of when you write it, you come to the bottom line and you kind of close it like a square bracket over there. You drop below the line, and you can see over there, that's what a final nun looks like. So the length of that vertical stroke would be the same length as that vertical stroke when you have a final kaf. So that's a final nun. Once again, you mustn't confuse a final nun with a final kaf. You see that? Okay. So it is very important that when you have a final nun, that little horizontal stroke over there is about half the length of what that horizontal stroke is of the final kaf. So don't confuse those two letters. That's a final kaf, that is a final nun. A nun at the end of the word. The final pay, when the pay stands at the end of the word, it will be written like that in the beginning, okay, with a dot in it. Then it is like you are drawing a pay. You can see over there, the top is basically the same, but instead of when you come down and you rest it on the line, you just drop it below the line, the same distance down as what you have done with a final nun and with a final kaf. Okay? And then the last one is the tzadeh. The tzadeh at the end of the word also has a final form. So that when tzadeh is written at the beginning of the word or in the middle of the word, that will be its form. But when tzadeh stands as the last word in Hebrew, it will take on that form. So it's just as if you are drawing a tzadeh. It's just that this little curve over there that rests on the line. You bring it down and then you drop it below the line, and then you've got that same length down as you have with the final pay, a final nun and a final kaf. And those then are what we call the final forms of those letters. Okay? So you have to get used to them, get used to seeing them, and as I will show you how we draw them will also be different. Questions? Yes?
With regards to the kaf and the pay, when they end, would it always be with the gesh lene?
Without the dagesh linear.
Without that?
Yeah, and then they will be pronunciated
Softly.
because the dot is not there. Correct.
Okay.
So that's a kaf over there, and I've written it with a dot, to show you that's the way in which you'll normally get it, especially at the beginning of the word or the beginning of a syllable. Because words can be divided into syllables, and we're going to be learning the rules for syllablification in Hebrew. But when the kaf stands at the end of the word, it will drop its dagesh lini, and so the pronunciation of that will be ch. The pronunciation of that, the final pay, will be f, and not p. Okay? Because you can see there's no dot inside it. Any other questions? Are we good with that? Okay, so that's what we call the final forms. Right, now the next two classifications, the first one is not so important for now. It's just something that you need to be aware of. So language has got this very interesting characteristic, that depending on the language you are in, there are certain sounds that work well together, and there are certain sounds that don't work well together. Okay? And that is what these categories of letters are going to do. Now, the first category are the letters that has got an S sound in it. And that S sound has got a technical name. They are called sibilants. Words that has got an S-type sound in it. And they are the letters Zayin. You can hear it, it's kind of an S-type sound there. Samech is there. Tzade, it's got a S kind of sound. Sin and Shin. Okay? So those 5 letters we classify as the sibilants. The letters of the alphabet that has got an S sound. That's all you need to know for now. That these letters are classified as sibilants. In the second semester, you are going to see how when we are learning verb patterns, how the characteristics of certain sounds, letters, when you combine them with other letters, then there are changes that happens. So let me give you an example of this. You will remember in Greek, like what happens in English, you can take 2 vowels and you put them together and they create a new sound. They're called diphthongs. Yeah, diphthongs. Right? So you can take an O and an O and you put them together, it becomes oo. Yeah. So by bringing 2 things together, you create a different sound. Now, it's similar to that, what sibilants are going to do. When they occur in combination with other sounds, there are crazy things that's going to happen. In fact, what sibilants are going to do is, when they occur with the letter T, they're going to get swapped around. So that instead of a word being spelled a particular way, for the sake of pronunciation, because it's almost natural to do that, you will swap it around. And there are other characteristics like this, and I'm always trying to think of examples, but the one example that sticks with me is, when I learned Hebrew at university, it was at Stellenbosch. My professor used this example, that the word Stellenbosch, you can hear it in English, it takes a lot of effort to move from the L to the M. Stellenbosch. Now, when you say it in Afrikaans, it is Stellenbosch. And when you listen to people speaking in Stellenbosch, they won't say, in normal spoken language, they won't say Stellenbosch, because they will say Stellenbosch. The N becomes an M, naturally, because it's just an easier way of doing it. And you can probably think of other words in English where that happens, where we become lazy in pronunciation. But with time, that laziness becomes a rule. And that's what happens with sibilants. Sibilants in combination with some other letters, you're going to see, these kind of strange things happening that probably happen as part of spoken language, but that with time actually got brought into the language, and then they become a rule. So for now, all we need to know is that the sibilants are these 5 letters that's got an S sound associated with it. The next one, and this is the last set that we are looking at, letters within the alphabet that have got characteristics that's very important. The last one are those letters classified as gutturals. The letters classified as gutturals. The letters classified as gutturals, pardon my spelling mistake of esophagus, is the letter Aleph, the letter Hey, the letter Chet, the letter Ayin, and the letter Resh. Those 5 letters in Hebrew are classified as the gutturals. Why are they called gutturals? Because these are the letters in the Hebrew alphabet that takes the greatest effort to pronunciate, because the sound comes out of your gut, or more specifically out of your esophagus. You have to make a lot of effort to kind of pronunciate that, in which some of them that's very easy to hear. The letter Chet, for example, very strong, guttural sound. The letter Hey, which is like a softened Chet sound. You hear, takes effort, to say that. The letter Aleph and the letter Ayin I will comment on briefly, but also to then say the letter Resh, technically speaking, especially in Shofaric Hebrew pronunciation, is technically not a guttural. Because you can hear that the sound, while the air comes from your gut, it's not the same kind of effort to say her. However, it might be that the Ashkenazi pronunciation, compared to the Shofaric pronunciation, where the Resh sound is made by vibrating your tongue against your teeth to say her, Ashkenazis pronounce it in the back of their throat. They will say, and that is where the Resh kind of sounds like a guttural. But be that as it may, what we do know in biblical Hebrew, it always behaves like a guttural, and therefore it gets classified as a guttural. Okay? So when we talk about the letters of the Hebrew alphabet that are gutturals, we will say it is the Aleph, the Hey, the Chet, the Ayin, and the Resh. They are the gutturals. Now let me say this. This is going to be vitally important, because what you're going to encounter is that there's going to be a ton of grammatical rules, as we call it, that is going to come about because of these fellows. Because they cause the most problems as far as pronunciation is concerned. Because they take so much effort to say that when you use them in words, they will dominate so much that they will create their own rules of grammar. They will create their own characteristics that becomes rules of grammar. Okay? And so it's very important to know them, because you're going to see later on, that when we begin to describe certain grammatical features of Hebrew, we will say these words are put together, and when you say these two sounds together, and when you bring in these characteristics and these features, this is what happens. But gutturals are going to say, no. You don't ignore us. We want to be, and we have to be pronunciated correctly. So in order to pronunciate this correctly, you're going to have to make certain changes. You're going to have to accommodate us. Okay? And that's what's going to happen. You're going to see that when I give you, later on when we talk about rules for grammar, you're going to encounter that we're going to say, this is typically how it happens, but when it involves a guttural, the guttural is going to cause changes to happen. And that's how you're going to have to remember the application that we call the rules of grammar. The rules that dictates how things get spelled and how things get pronunciated. Okay? And that's going to be because of the gutturals. Okay? And so prepare yourself for that. especially in the second semester, right? When we're going to be learning the verb, which is the most important word in Biblical Hebrew. It is the verb in Biblical Hebrew goes through the most changes compared to any other word in Hebrew. And part of the reason for that is what we call the morphology of the verb. You know, how the word changes in terms of its patterns because of things that get added to the beginning and things that gets added to the end. You would have learned that in Greek, right? So when you have one of your most basic verbs, let's talk about the basic declension of lu verbs. Remember that. Remember the verb luo. Remember that verb? Luo, which means I lose, right? You will learn that in Greek, you can have the subject of the verb written inside the verb in what we call its inflection. The part of the verb that changes into a predictable and a discernible pattern. But the root will remain the same. Okay? So you, for example, learned, and I still remember this, your declension of lu verbs to indicate what we call its congruency, to identify who the subject of the verb is, who the object of the verb is, and what the number is. Okay, remember? Right? Then you get luo, lues, lue, luomen, luete, luusen. Lu is still there because that's the root, but the inflection changes. And that's what we call the changes in the morphology, the way in which the verb is written according to a particular pattern. The same thing is going to happen in Hebrew. And most of the times, why that is going to happen is going to be because of these guys. It's gutturals that is mostly going to bring about those changes. And so your verb chart looks very intimidating when you see it in Hebrew. But as I say to students, get to know the pattern. Because once you know the pattern, you actually never have to memorize the verb chart. You must just remember the pattern. And remember the tune, remember the song. And it becomes easy. Okay? So those are going to be very important. And very soon, when we're going to get into words and the characteristics of words, for example, even adding the word the to a word that starts with a guttural is going to cause spelling changes to take place. And so later on, when you're going to see how the word the is going to be written, we're going to say to you, this is the way in which the is normally written. But the minute the is added to a word that starts with a guttural, these are the changes that's going to happen. And in fact, some of that changes is going to be dictated by the nature of the guttural. Okay? So, once again, very, very important. Any questions on that? Okay, we're getting to information overload already. Okay, let me say one more thing. One more thing on the gutturals. You know, because I've mentioned this and I've defined it in the beginning. I want to try and illustrate it. So you will remember that the Hebrew alphabet consists just of consonants. And unlike the English alphabet and the Greek alphabet, that has got the same origin as the Hebrew alphabet, which is the Phoenician alphabet. The Phoenician alphabet consisted only of consonants. The Hebrew alphabet consists only of consonants. And so even though the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet has the same origin as the first letter of the Greek alphabet, the first letter of the Greek alphabet, like the first letter of the English alphabet, the letter A, which is derived from alpha, they are vowels. In Hebrew, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet is a consonant. It's not a vowel. Okay? And so we say that this is a silent letter. It gets treated as a silent letter. Not just the letter Aleph, but also the letter Ayin. Now, why are they silent? Well, the reason for that is, we know that historically, those letters, those consonants, actually carried a phonetic value. They had a sound value. But they were sound values that were so difficult to make, especially when you're using them in spoken language that with time they just disappeared. Now it's not like that idea should be foreign, because we've got ways even of doing that in English. We call it contractions. Okay? So you can say in English, you should not do that. Think about the word should and think about the word not. We've got a shorter way of saying that, don't we? We cause a letter to disappear, the letter O. And then we show its presence through an apostrophe. And then we bring the two together and we create a new word. We say shouldn't. You shouldn't do that. Are you with me? You know. So I'm explaining to you a concept that happens in language, but it happens everywhere. It just sounds strange when you have to consider it in another language. But we've got a version of this in English that we call contractions. So in the word shouldn't, we know that there's a letter that's supposed to be there, the letter O, but it's not there. But we show that it has disappeared by an apostrophe. Now that concept was then borrowed to describe and to illustrate what happens with an aleph and an ayin. You know, because remember, when we transliterate the alphabet, we are trying to find the English equivalent for that Hebrew sound. But there's no English equivalent for what an aleph would have originally sounded like and what an ayin would have originally sounded like. Because even in modern Hebrew, there are silent letters. They are never pronunciated, but they have to be there. We've created that in words like knife. Everybody knows what a knife is. How do you spell knife? You will tell me it starts with the letter K. Now, why is the letter K there? We don't say it. It's a silent letter. But to spell knife correctly, you have to have the letter K. Do you know why? Because historically, we used to say knife. That was in Old English how the word was pronunciated. But with time, we said, trying to say a K and an N together. Knife. You know, it's awkward. And so somehow in spoken language, the sound of the K disappeared. And it was no longer pronunciated. It's now silent. But it still belongs there for correct spelling. Same thing happened with aleph. You know, aleph originally had a value, but with time, it became so difficult to say it as the K in the word knife, that it just disappeared. Now, what would it have sounded like? Well, the best approximation that we have is to say consonantally, aleph as a guttural, its sound would have to start in the esophagus, come through the larynx, and it is the sound of air coming out of your larynx that is briefly stopped in the back of your throat, and then you open up your throat again. So the sound that an aleph would have made would be something like this. That would have been an aleph. Imagine trying to make that sound. So that even for Hebrew speakers, it's very difficult. What is an ayin? Well, an ayin is a softer version, supposed to be, of an aleph. It's the sound coming out in which, instead of closing the back of your throat, you really close, you hardly close it, and then you open it a bit up again, so that it would be something like, did you hear that? Very difficult sound. Okay? And so, with time, those difficult sounds became not difficult because you just started to ignore it, and they became silent letters, like the letter K in the word knife. But they have to be there for correct spelling. But what is the value that we're going to give them? How are we going to transliterate them? So because there is no letter of the English alphabet that gives us that approximation of sound, we do and we use the apostrophe to transliterate an aleph, and we use a reverse apostrophe to translate an ayin. To take that one step further, some very clever writers of grammar have said, do you know what? If you listen to some English words actually has got the idea of an aleph in it. So think, for example, of the word, and I use this on the video as well, the English word bottle. Bottle. Okay? So with a bottle, B-O-T-T-L-E. Break the word up into syllables. What is the sound that you hear between the B and the O sound? There's something that happens there when you say the word bottle. You hear what is called a glottal stop. Briefly, sound comes through your esophagus and you cut it off and you open it again. So that you say, you don't just say bottle, you say bottle. You hear that there's that little sound that happens there, and that's an aleph. Iron, they don't have a version for that. No. But that's it. Yeah. And so I share that with you for your benefit. As you think about the characteristics of these letters and how they are going to be affecting, as we're going to be seeing very soon, the way in which words are put together and the way in which words are then pronunciated. Any questions on that? Okay, so there's two more things I'm wanting to do. The first one is, how do you then write these letters? Since it's very clear that when we take a look at the Hebrew alphabet, and you look at it there at the bottom, clearly the Hebrew alphabet was devised at a time that, especially for what we will call printed Hebrew, but which was actually Hebrew that was copied by hand. The tools that they would use is that they would use what we would call a quill pen. The stylus that looks like a quill pen, which means that you basically have a feather or a reed. You probably have done this. Some of us are old enough to remember fountain pens. The pen that you would use with ink, you would draw it up into the pen, and then at the edge of the pen, there would be a special nib, which some fountain pens had a sharp nib, but some of them had a nib that was cut off flat. So that by writing with one stroke, just depending on how you angle that pen, you can either get a thin line, or you could get very nice rounded forms like that. We no longer use those pens. We use ballpoint pens. And so how do we do that? And so there are different ways that people have developed, and so that when you take a look at different Hebrew grammars, you will see that some of them will illustrate how you actually write the letters using your normal pen. And so I've illustrated that over here, by counting the number of strokes that you would have to engage in to do that. I did use a slightly bolder pen, and I used a Koki to do that, but that's to kind of make it stand out. But you will see, for example, that you will draw the letter Aleph, and if we do it using our broad lines, like we will typically have, we won't write them from line to line. We leave a little gap like we will do it in English. But with each of the letters, I normally say to students, as you're starting it and as you're practicing it, you have to imagine a little square in which the letter is normally formed inside that square in some way or the other. So think of the letter Aleph, which looks almost like an English letter X, and think of the corners as the top left-hand corner, the top right-hand corner, the bottom right-hand corner, and the bottom left-hand corner. And that forms the basic square in which, for aesthetics, when you are writing it, you try and keep your characters to look more or less the same size. Look, some of them will be slightly narrower, and some of them will be slightly longer, but generally, you need to think of that orientation of the square. So that an Aleph is formed in two strokes, starting, for example, top right-hand corner, you make your way down to the bottom left-hand corner, but instead of just going in a straight diagonal line, you create a little curve in the middle and you come down. And then you start in the top left-hand corner, as you can see the arrow suggest over here, and you draw a diagonal line to the bottom right-hand corner, and that's how you will form an Aleph. So that same principle occurs with all of the other letters. You imagine a square, so that when you come to the letter bait, you imagine a square over there, where the bottom of the bait, the base, is bottom left-hand corner of the square, bottom right-hand corner of the square. You start top left-hand corner of the square, you go just over the middle, you draw a little curve down like that, you create your base, and your third stroke is the dot in the middle, and that's how you write the letter bait. Are you with me? The letter Gimel is slightly narrower. It's not going to be, but we kind of use the top and the bottom of the square, so you have this little curve like that inside the square, not exactly in the left-hand corner, not exactly in the middle, slightly to the left of middle. You draw the little curve down like that, you give it a little foot, and you put the dot inside it. And that's how you will write the letter Gimel. The same thing with the letter Dalet. Top left-hand corner, you go to the top right-hand corner, you drop down to the bottom right-hand corner, you lift your pen, you make the dot, and that will be a Dalet. Okay, so that same principle will occur with all of the letters. Now I'm going to leave that to you, to practice on your own, to take a look at, and to see, am I able to now practice writing my Hebrew letters with my pen using that guide, which, as I said, you follow the pictures that I have there, it's going to be very easy. Even your final letters, that is how our final letters will be formed. You can see there, almost like you're drawing a Dalet, but you have top left-hand corner to top right-hand corner, a stroke. You go down to the bottom right-hand corner, but then you drop it below the line, and that will be a final cuff. But you compare that to, say, a final nun, you will see they look similar, but that short little horizontal stroke over there is half the size of that horizontal stroke of the final cuff, and that gives you a final nun. Okay? But the final main is formed like that, like a square, with a little tail that sticks out over there, and that's the final pay, and that's the final tzadeh. Yes?
So does it go 3/4 to the line, or is it is it 3/4 to the line?
Yeah, at the bottom?
Yeah, at the bottom.
Yeah, I would say, at least somewhere half, 3/4. It's not so much that it's exactly there, but for the sake of consistency, you have to keep them the same. So if you go half, make sure all your others is half. If you go 3/4 like I have over here, make sure all the others go 3/4, because aesthetically they have to kind of fall in the same pattern.
Yeah.
Even though some of them is above the line, some of them is below the line, it becomes very, very neat.
I saw pins. My daughter does art, and
calligraphy pins.
Yeah, that you can actually draw.
Yeah, that you can do that. Yeah. But even nowadays, people don't bother, because even in modern Hebrew, they don't use calligraphy pens.
Okay.
Because we've got printers that can print Hebrew fonts. they no longer, it is rare, some very Orthodox Jews will believe that your Torah scrolls and your scrolls of the Bible has to be copied by hand. And then they get into this calligraphy, and some of them, and you can see this in scrolls over the years, they become very fanciful, very artistic, etc. Because it becomes a thing of beauty. So just like old Bibles, for example, they would use what you call Gothic letters. Letters where, say for example, you're doing Genesis chapter 1 verse 1, and it would always happen in the title page of the Bible. They would take the letter I, they would make a super large letter I for the word in the beginning, and they will say big letter I, but they'll make that I so fanciful, that it sometimes go to the bottom of the page, and, there's a picture involved in it. That's aesthetics. People like to do things very, very fancy, very fancifully. But modern Hebrew, they don't even bother. They write like we write, with a pen, and they've even developed their own. So there is even a modern notation for writing Hebrew that they have developed. But because we are sticking with biblical Hebrew, we kind of have a more or less a standard way of doing that. As I said, you will discover some Hebrew grammars where they will write it slightly differently. And I'm happy with that, as long as you don't confuse the letters. You know, then it's okay. Right. The last thing I then want to do is to then begin to get you into reading biblical Hebrew. Okay, because that's the goal, right? So here's a little exercise that I'm developing, that I've developed, you know, just to kind of take us through this. And let me say, on Wednesday we're not having a tutorial class. My expectation is that you're going to be viewing the video of what I'm explaining. You know, and then I will follow that up with some other videos, which will then in the future include these kinds of things that I'm going to be doing. But I want to show you how, when you begin to read Hebrew, the way in which words get formed, okay, it's going to be the combination of the consonants, but together with the vowel points. Now, we've not covered Hebrew vowels yet. But your ability to be able to read a Hebrew word depends on your ability to be able to, at an instant, recognize a letter and say, I know this letter, I know its name, but more importantly, I know its phonetic value. I know the sound value that is associated with that letter. And in fact, there are a number of Hebrew words, and that's why I've chosen this particular list, just the consonants of that word, that when you look at it and you are able to identify the consonant and you begin to sound it, you actually get a clue, because to a large degree, a lot of our English tends to retain that, typically with names. So most of the words I'm going to be giving you now is names. So let's start with that first word over there. That word, consonantally, consists of 3 letters. The first one is a dalet with a dagish lead in it. So that means you say it, da. Then there is a vaf, and the vaf makes the sound v. Right? And the last letter is a dalet without a dot. So it is still d. Now try and say that by just saying the consonant. The sound that the dalet makes is d. The sound that the vaf makes is v, and the sound that the dalet makes is d. Now try and say that together. David. What does it sound like? David. That's David's name in Hebrew, consonantally. See, so just by saying it, by being able to pronunciate the sound of each letter, and you pull that together, you are beginning to form words. Okay? The word is going to be David with the vowel points. Okay, but as it stands there consonantally, it is David, you know, which is David, correct. Okay. Very good. Next one. Let's see. What is that? We start with the simple ones. That's a gimel, and then a dalet. So gimel with a dot, still g, and then dalet without a dot is still a d. That's a name in Hebrew. Gad. Gada. So what is the vowel? The vowel is actually Gad, Gad. That's the word for the name for Gad in Hebrew.
Okay. Who got that? Well done. Come on.
Now we can't always keep things too simple.
Yeah.
But you know, it's still close. So that's another name in Hebrew. It's a resh in the beginning, followed by a chait, and then a lamed. So try and say that consonantally. The sound of a resh is r, the sound of a chait is ch, and the sound of an l, lamed is l. So try and say that consonantly. Rachel. Yeah, very close to the Afrikaans Rachel, because of that sound. That's Rachel's name in Hebrew. Rachel in Hebrew it's going to be. So a lot of the English names comes more or less from retaining the Hebrew. So that's Rachel, Rachel. Reish, her, chait, l. Say it together, her, l. Sounds like Rachel is Rachel. Next one. Hey, Gimel, Reish. What do you think that is?
Hagar.
Hagar, correctly. Not Hagar the horrible. But rather Hagar, who was?
Abraham's cousin?
Yes, yeah.
Sarah.
Yeah. Hagar. Hagar. So that's Hagar's name. Hagar. Sounds like Hagar, which is Hagar's name. Okay. Slightly more complicated. Two words that becomes one word. Yes? Bethlehem. That's Bethlehem in Hebrew. Beit, Yod, Tav. So it is, in Hebrew it's going to be Beit, which literally means house of. And then Lamed, Chet, final name. Take note that's a final name at the end. Will be L'chem. It's the word for bread, in fact. So Bethlehem literally means the house of bread. Beit Lechem. That is Bethlehem. You getting the picture?
Yeah, Gina is.
Takes a bit of practice, you'll get there. That one.
What's it? Yisro.
Israel. That's Israel in Hebrew. Starts with a yot, y sound, followed by a sin sound, followed by a resh, r sound. Then you've got the silent letter aleph, and you've got the l at the end. So say that consonantally.
Yisro.
Yisrael. Yisrael. Israel is going to be in Hebrew. So that's the name for Israel. Gets more complicated. That one. Jerusalem is. That is Jerusalem in Hebrew. Yod, y sound, followed by a resh, followed by a vaf. Now that vaf is actually going to become a vowel in Hebrew. We'll talk about that later. Then you have a shin, not a sin sound. The dot is on the right, remember. When the dot is on the left, it's wrong, it's sin. Sin. When it's on the right, it's shin. Okay? So shin, then a lamed, then a yod, and a final name. Okay? So trying to say that consonantally becomes Yerushalayim without vowels. Yerushalayim, it's going to be with vowels. The word for Jerusalem. Jerusalem. That one.
Elohim.
Elohim. Now that's the word Elohim, which is the general word for God in Hebrew. The word used in Genesis chapter 1 to describe God. Elohim. The aleph is silent, and there's a lamed, there's a hey, there's a yod. That yod is actually going to form part of a vowel you're going to see later on in the final name. But try and say that consonantally will be the yum. Okay, the S sound will make it Elohim. That one.
It's your turn now.
Okay, this is a bit of a trick question. But I thought that you should be able to see that. That is the divine name.
Yahweh.
The divine name in Hebrew.
Yahweh.
What is sometimes called the Yod Hey Vav Hey, because that's the consonants of God's personal name, the divine name. The Yod, the Hey, the Vav, and the Hey. That is pronunciated how?
Yehovah.
We don't actually know. We don't know how God's name was pronunciated. So it is often transliterated by the English Yod, which is a Y, the Hey, which is an H, the Vav, which is kind of a W or V sound, and the Hey, the Yod Hey Vav Hey, that we guess today. It's an educated guess. It's not a certainty, that God's name would probably have been pronunciated as Yahweh. Yahweh. Very awkward. We say Yahweh, because in English we treat a hey at the end of a consonant as a vowel. In Hebrew, you can't do that. A hey at the end of a syllable inside a word will retain its consonantal value, so you must all say it. So when people say, God's name is Yahweh, I say to them, no, you're not reading your Hebrew correctly, because the hey of the Yah has to be said if you're following your rules of grammar. But we don't actually know how the name was pronunciated. It is actually from this name that we get the incorrect Jehovah. So sometimes you guys sing, there's no God like Jehovah. I stand in church, I sing, there's no word like Jehovah.
It sounds like us, Gina.
There's no one like Jehovah.
Yes.
So, Doc, I came across this when I was looking into the Jehovah Witnesses, and so they are sticklers for using
Jehovah.
the original name.
Yes.
But they're using the incorrect version of that original name.
Yes. Now, why is that the case? So let me introduce this to you. This is where I'm going to finish off today. This is a note to you. So just like you have discovered that in Hebrew, there are sounds that Hebrew makes that we don't have in English. The same is true in reverse. English has got sounds that Hebrew doesn't have, and one of that is the letter J. Hebrew does not have the letter J. English has got the letter J. But what does that mean if I'm saying that English has got the letter J but not Hebrew? Then that means all the names that we have in our English Bibles that starts with the letter J is pronunciated wrong. Like Jerusalem, Jesus, Jehoshaphat. Okay, Jesus is New Testament.
Yes,
But
yes.
variations of his name occurs in the Old Testament. Like Joshua. Because Joshua is Old Testament for Jesus.
Yeah.
Joshua, the river Jordan, all of those names have been incorrectly transliterated into our English Bible. Why did that happen? Blame Martin Luther. Probably. Because when Martin Luther translated the Bible from Hebrew into German, in German it's not a problem. Your Hebrew letter Yod can be pronunciated by the J in German, which is the sound Y, not J in English. So that's what Luther did. In German it's a correct transliteration. Now, I can remember growing up as a teenager, I used to read war comics. I don't know if you came across comics, at this before many of your time. I used to read war comics. And in war comics it was about World War II, and it was the Americans fighting the Japanese and the English fighting the Germans. And they would all say, I thought the word for attention was jarol, because I was reading it like an English person. And then I learned a little bit of German when I was doing German for theological studies. In fact, I knew before that the German J is actually like your English Y sound. So that it wasn't jaro, it was yaro, which meant attention. Because that was a word they often used in the comics. So, there is no equivalent for the English letter J. That's why Jehovah is wrong. There is no J sound in Hebrew. Our English Bibles have incorrectly transliterated the Hebrew Yod with a J sound due to the influence of the German translation. But the reason why they get Jehovah, I'll teach you later. Jehovah wasn't plucked out of the air. There's actually a phenomenon in Hebrew that seems to give you that word. But I first have to teach you vowels, and then I have to teach you how those vowels were used on that word, the divine name, because it was the use of the vowels from another word that was imported into the divine name that gave the impression that you've got the word Jehovah, but it's not. Because the guys who invented, and we finish now, the guys who invented the vowel points, the Masoretes, we're going to learn about them next week, they came up with a way of trying to communicate the way in which they pronunciated the divine name, which was that they didn't pronunciate the divine name.
Yeah.
So how do you do that? How, after years of never pronunciating God's name, which then gets lost, just like an aleph sound gets lost, the pronunciation of the divine name got lost, because they would read the text, and when they would come to the divine name, they would stop, say nothing, and then move on, which was awkward. And so what they did was, they started reading another name in the place of the divine name, out of respect for God's name. Why would they do that?
Because they're not allowed to pronounce
Because
the name.
why would they not technically be allowed to pronunciate it? Because it's not that you don't want to do it, you don't want to break the commandment. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. So just in case you use his name in vain, don't even say it. And do that long enough, you forget how to say it. But now what are you going to do? So that's what the Masoretes did. They said, we are now going to put in practice in the text what our practice is for saying it. And when they would come to the divine name, they would use another Hebrew word. They would use the word Adonai, which is the word that means my Lord.
Yeah.
And they would read my Lord in the place of the divine name. In fact, they started taking the vowel points of that word and they added to that, which when you even it out according to Hebrew grammar, you get this anomalous word Jehovah, but which was never a word. It was the way to indicate to the reader of the text that when you come to the divine name, you must recognize that the vowel points is the vowel points of this other word that must be read in the place of the divine name, and that's the word Adonai. And that's how we invented the word Jehovah for God.
So how do you say that then?
We don't say it.
Yeah.
So in Hebrew, when we read it, I read it like the Masoretes. We come across the divine name, we say Adonai.
Okay.
We will say what is not there in the text.
Okay.
Because we don't know how to say what's in the text. And because the Masoretes told us this is the way the text must be read. When you come to the divine name, don't try and attempt to say the divine name, say Adonai.
Okay. So we'll say Adonai
So we
next.
will say Adonai when we come to the divine name.
And that's correct.
And that will be correct.
Okay. Okay.
Yes.
That's also why in the English they have the Lord of the capital.
Yes, and so that's why, if you read English translations, when they put the word Lord in capital letters, capital O, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, that's an indication that in the Hebrew text, the divine name, the tetragrammaton occurs. But the word Adonai also occurs. And so that you put as lowercase, or if you're using it as a term of honor, because you don't just call the Lord. Sarah can call her husband Lord as a way of respect. That will be the word Adonai. It is not the tetragrammaton. Therefore, it will be lowercase l, or if it's the beginning of the sentence, capital letter L, lowercase o, R, D. And then you get the word Lord.
So you only get Lord in capital letters in the Old Testament?
Yes.
Okay.
In English translations of the Old Testament.
Okay. And then that
Modern
would be-
Jews will use the word the name in Hebrew when they come to the tetragrammaton. They will say Hashem. The word Hashem means the name. And so that's what modern Hebrew has done. They come to the tetragrammaton, they will say the name. In other words, in the text, it's the divine name, but we don't say it. We will indicate that the divine name is present in the text by using the word Hashem. Or when they write it in English, they will say capital letter G, a dash, and a capital letter D. God's name, the tetragrammaton we call it, the covenantal name for God is used in the text, but we won't say it out of respect for God and because we don't want to use his name in vain.
And when do you use the G hyphen D?
We don't do that. Modern day Jews do that.
Okay, because I see it online
Yes,
sometimes,
online, yeah. So-
and then
so
I'm
some
like,
people-
but don't you like? I thought it was like derogatory.
No, it's not because it's actually respect that they are saying when they refer to God and they're thinking of God in terms of His divine name, or they quote a scripture in which they know the divine name occurs in that text, they will replace the divine name by capital letter G dash capital letter D, God.
And what period did they use that from? From Moses to?
Our guess is that anywhere, we don't know exactly when it happened, anywhere from the year 200 BC till around the year 500 AD, somewhere during that period, the practice arose, in which they stopped saying God's name. And therefore, the pronunciation has been lost. And our best guess is that the Tetragrammaton would probably have been pronunciated Yahweh. But we cannot say for certain.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Have a good night.